Our Welsh government is so fixated on pleasing black people, they've made black history compulsory in Welsh schools. Now, Welsh history is not compulsory, but black history is. Now, this is the only black history of Cardiff that I'm aware of. This video that I'll put on now.
Up until recent times, the history of a series of violent race riots that occurred right across Britain in 1919 has remained little known. The bare facts are that throughout that year, riots broke out across the country. The protagonists were, in the main, young white men who, having returned home after being demobbed from the army, were disturbed and disillusioned to discover large colonies of migrant labour now living in parts of what had been white working-class areas of their cities. Former hopes of a better future following the end of the Great War were in stark contrast to the actuality of the circumstances the ex-servicemen returned home to. In each instance, there were similar accusations of minorities grooming or pimping white women, taking jobs once reserved for the native British, taking over parts of the cities and towns that had long been the preserve of white working-class British families, and all contributing to a growing atmosphere amongst the many returning soldiers of an indignant outrage with the post-war domestic state of affairs. Trouble erupted simultaneously in Cardiff and Barry on the evening of the 12th. An article in the South Wales News on the 13th began by summarising the situation in both locations. Quote, "In a series of riots last night, 2 white men were killed and 16 injured. One of these, a discharged soldier with a record of 4 years war service, was fatally stabbed in Beverley Street, Cadoxton, Barry. An extraordinary riot broke out at Cardiff too late last night. An argument developed into blows and a manhunt. The Negroes used revolvers and razors freely. A white man was gashed in the neck and died in the hospital. A soldier shot in the thigh, and a policeman hit by a large stone in the temple. When the crowd was dispersing peacefully along Bute Street, fresh shots rang out from a side street. The police leading the mob made after the blacks, who vanished into a house. Forcing an entry, the officers, after a violent struggle, made several arrests. The house was subsequently set on fire and burnt out." End quote. In the initial incident in Barry, according to a witness, the 30-year-old former soldier Frederick Henry Longman was outside of his own house when 2 black men came up the street. A witness stated that Longman spoke to the men, and they began a conversation, before Longman was suddenly attacked and a melee broke out. In the struggle, Longman was stabbed just beneath the heart and expired on the street. The killer was eventually apprehended. The suspect, one Charles Emmanuel from the French West Indies, was later tried and jailed for manslaughter. The trouble continued in Cardiff. In the brawling and chaos, the crowds grew ever larger, and the police, struggling to maintain control, were unable to prevent an enraged crowd forcefully entering a bar where their quarry, a large group of armed blacks, had apparently gone to ground. Shots rang out as the crowd stormed the bar to overpower the gunmen, and an ex-serviceman named John Donovan was shot through the heart and another gashed on the head with a razor before the besieged Africans were finally arrested. The events underlined both the fractious and potentially incendiary results of forced multiculturalism, allied with the callous, mercantile desires of a ruling class who sought to ensure with cheap imported labour profits over the well-being of the indigenous people. Unsurprisingly, when the history of that extraordinary year is being reviewed at all, it is digested as part of an ongoing historical revisionism that seeks to demonstrate racial prejudice and brutish bigotry on the part of the indigenous white British men, while simultaneously underlining the victimhood of the BAME participants. By examining the extant primary sources, sadly familiar but nevertheless disturbing, accounts of the insidious effects of modern multiculturalism can be found in all of its initial manifestations here in Britain. Indeed, the war-weary British Empire, in marked decline following the war, facilitated this situation, and for those Welsh troops returning home, there was a strong feeling of betrayal and resentment that, having finally quit the trenches, the promised land fit for heroes, so dearly paid for, was clearly never going to arrive. Instead, as one demobbed Welsh soldier explained to a journalist, we went out to France, and when we come back we find these foreigners have got our jobs, our businesses, and our houses, and we can't get rid of them.